Well, we are moving now from the main events and geography of the book, past the main characters, which we looked at last week, to the purpose for the writing of the book of Mark. Why did Mark write? Well, he wrote for the Romans. That's who he wrote for. To set forth Christ as the servant of Jehovah. That's what Phillips has to say. That he wrote for the Romans primarily, setting forth Christ as Jehovah's servant. Just to add to that a little bit, did you miss something? Oh. According to Henry Thiessen, Mark wrote at the request of many Romans that he reduced to writing the preaching of Peter. That would be the occasion for the book, or the explicit purpose for writing. If that's historically true, if Clement of Alexandria's comment is true, then this book is really the answer to the request of a number of people that were living in the first century in Rome. That Mark wrote at the request of many Roman Christians. Mm-hmm.
Instead of reading the account of this part of the church.
Herbert Lockyer puts it in a different light. He says that Mark wrote for the Romans whose watchword was power. Let me just read for you the whole quote here. It's 3 or 4 lines long. The average energetic Roman cared little for doctrine. Dynamic, he was for action. Thus Mark is eloquent with and exhibits the omnipotence of the mighty miracle worker, and likewise the omnipotence of love as the crowning passion and resurrection of Christ's service. Almost half the book is taken up with some comprehensive summary of Christ's ministry of power. Power, that is the purpose. To show Christ as a powerful servant is, according to Lockyer, the theme or the purpose for the book. Not theme, but purpose. He wanted to show that this man was a servant, but he was a powerful servant. Doesn't that come through? Jesus is busy doing all kinds of things, but he heals people he raises people from the dead, and he heals withered hands and palsied people and all of these things, and cast demons out of people. You talk about power. That's right. Thiessen says that this servant conception is a remarkable blend of strength and submission, achieving victory through apparent defeat. This is something that would very much appeal to Roman Christians in particular. Sort of as you've mentioned, a seeming contradiction. This servant is a remarkable blend of strength and submission we see in the life of Christ. Mm-hmm.
Well, if I was Mark and I was reading this one, I bet I can go to the country so really point out this one there. John, you're wrong. I read this.
Well, it all depends on which Romans you're talking about. He was telling the story. You have to put the historical events in to even tell the narrative, to complete the narrative. For the Roman Christians, if in fact he wrote it for Christians primarily, it wouldn't have been any skin off his neck or any problem to him, although if it fell into the hands of the wrong Romans, unsaved people, well, yes, I agree. In fact, it was. You know, that if this was written during the period of the Neronian, he would, regardless of whether he wrote it or not, he was in trouble as a Christian. So now, the purpose for the writing usually fits in well with the theme or the message of the book. In presenting Christ as the servant of Jehovah, there are 3 or 4 things that are dominant, that are clearly seen in the book of Mark. One are the deeds. It's a gospel of deeds. Thiessen says that Mark presents Christ as a strenuous worker hastening from one task to another, strenuously laboring, even on his holidays, feeding 5,000 people. You've heard the phrase, a mother's work is never done. Well, to the average Roman, what's a slave for? Work him. Right? A slave's work is never done, and that surely comes through in the book. There's a word that is translated straightway, forthwith, and immediately. The Greek word euthos, I think. And it's used 41 times in the book of Mark. By Mark. And it's in contrast, Matthew only uses the word 7 times and Luke 1 time. Luke uses it 7 times, or Matthew 7 times, and Luke 1 time. And the predominance of this word shows the quickness, the strenuousness of Christ, hastening, hurrying from one thing to another. As a gospel of deeds, there are 19 miracles recorded in this short little book, 2 of which are unique to Mark's gospel. 19 miracles, 2 of which are unique to this gospel. Which? 19 miracles, 2 of which are unique. It's significant that there is a theme in the book that is not mentioned. The absence of a genealogy. The absence of his birth account. The absence of the history of his childhood years. Those absent themes are significant because they're not important to Mark's purpose. Who's interested in the genealogy, the birth record, the childhood of a slave? The only thing they're interested in a slave is whether he's healthy or not and is doing his job. Right? Now, having said that one of the primary themes in the book are the deeds of Christ, we should not overlook the fact that the teachings of Christ are also part of the servant's ministry. The teachings of Christ are part of the deeds, if you will. They're something he did. And so you have 5 parables, 2 of which are unique, found in the book of Mark. There are passages where Jesus is sitting and talking. We've noted some of those already and are just going through the first 6 chapters. In most cases, the discourses themselves grow out of the works. That is, the miracles that Jesus did produced a discussion to follow. And so the teachings are not unrelated or impractical or theoretical or anything like that. They have something to do with the servant's works. Someone else has said, I think I might have gotten this from Scroggy, I don't recall now. You can double check it. That's why I encourage you to get the book, because he's such a wealth of information. But someone else has divided the miracles found in Mark into 25, as if there were 25 miracles, but several of them are multiple in nature, where he was casting out demons and doing this, and I'll just give it to you in one verse. The servanthood of Christ is stressed, showing him as overworked and undernourished. In chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, in chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, he came down off the mountain after sending out his disciples, and we were talking about this, that the multitude came together so they couldn't even eat. Right? It shows us a slave, you know. In Roman society, the slaves didn't eat first, they ate last. Chapter 3, verse 35, the slave does God's will. Jesus said, whosoever shall do the will of God, the same as my brother and my sister and my mother. Isn't it interesting that Jesus, if he is being presented by Mark as a servant, equates anyone that works like he does as if he was a relative. Right? And very frequently in Roman society, a person, that whole families would be taken into slavery as booty of war and stuff like that. There's almost a parallel that if anyone will spiritually do what Christ is, it's almost as if we're slaves. And in fact, isn't that the nature of Christianity? He sets us free, but he wants us to serve, and it's a reasonable thing for Christians. Now, this is a point of application I'd like to just make about this, that if anyone has the idea here tonight that becoming a Christian means that you're free to do whatever you want to do, you've basically missed the essence of the gospel. Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. It's only reasonable to serve the Lord, as a slave, to give him your whole body, soul, and spirit, because of the mercies that he's extended to you in the gospel. Paul calls himself bond slave of Jesus Christ, over and over and over. It was one of his favorite terms. And in fact, if you look at life realistically, and I'm preaching now, that regardless of where you are in your life, every one of you, whether you're saved or not saved, whether you're a new Christian or a mature Christian, whether you're educated or uneducated, it doesn't matter where we are in life, we're all slaves to something. What you do, you are a slave to. It's a principle that you find 3 times stated in the New Testament. Romans chapter 6, that whatever a man does, he's a slave to that. Jesus said, whosoever is the servant of sin, whosoever commits sin is the servant of sin. That is, whatever you do, you're a slave to that. Right? And so it's a fact that some people are slaves to entertainment. Some people are slaves to television. Some people are slaves to work. Some people are slaves to their own fleshly appetites. Some people are slaves to the ministry, serving the Lord. That's the desirable aim. And that's precisely the point that Jesus was making on this occasion. He's a slave, there's no question, and anybody that identifies with him and doing the will of God is likewise related to him as if he was a slave in the same family. Kind of an interesting point. Chapter 7, verse 37, this slave that Mark presents did all things well. This is a remarkable verse. 7:37. This is a commentary on one of the more dramatic miracles that Jesus had done. He healed the deaf mute. Everyone knows what a deaf mute is, a person that can neither hear nor talk. And when he healed the man, it says that the people were beyond measure astonished. Beyond measure astonished, saying he has done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. He hath done all things well. That's a commentary that the people gave to the work of this slave. He does his work well. During his service, Jesus suffered. Same chapter, verse 34. The things that Jesus was called upon to do caused him grief. In verse 34, when he was looking at this man, this deaf mute, he looked up to heaven and he sighed, said unto him, be open. I don't know, it doesn't explain why he sighed, but it shows us the compassion of Christ, that he really entered into his work. Also in chapter 8, verse 12 is an illustration. Again, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit when these Pharisees came asking for a sign. In there are other places. The shortest verse in the Bible is what? John 11:36. Jesus wept. That's not found in Mark, but it shows us the compassions of Christ. So he did all his work well, sometimes to the detriment of his own body and soul and spirit. And that's why he was here. He came. He was aware that when he came, he was going to ultimately give his life. Chapter 8, verse 31, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests. Right? So this is quite the servant. And so talking about the main theme in the book, we're talking about Mark presenting Christ as Jehovah's servant. He shows him as a doer of all kinds of miracles, quickly, sacrificially, compassionately. He's a servant by what he said, the parables that he spoke, tied in with his work. A.T. Robertson says that there are two great themes found in the book. This is another way to look at the themes. It's a little different way. He says there are two great themes to be found in the book. First is his ministry in Galilee. 9 whole chapters are devoted to Christ's ministry in Galilee. That is theme number 1. First 9 chapters. And the second great theme in the book is Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. Chapters 11 to 16. "38% of the Gospel of Mark covers the passion or the sufferings of Christ. Now, isn't that consistent with the picture of a servant? If I was to take a poll tonight and ask you to place yourself into one of these categories, that you have no problems, or life is nothing but a problem, or 50-50, I suppose we all take a stab at placing ourselves in one of those categories, right? But the very nature of a slave was basically down here. Nothing but problems in Roman society. They could be sold without notice. They could be killed and nobody would say a word. There were no laws against killing slaves. Right? They had no rights. They weren't considered. They were considered property. You know, and it was a pretty tough lot in life to be a slave. And so for Mark to be writing in a society that practiced this sort of thing and to present Christ as a slave, it's quite consistent that in his ministry, if he's going to picture him this way, that he puts a predominance on the sufferings of Christ, and almost more than any other book. 38% of his book is focused on the last week of Christ's life, which was his actual voluntary humbling of himself even to death. It's very consistent with the picture that we have of the servant of Jehovah. The only book that presents more of the sufferings of Christ is the Gospel of John. I think about 48% of the book or something like that in John is devoted to the same week. All right, so that's the themes and the message of the book. Let's talk a little bit about the key verses and the key chapters. Key words and phrases. I'm going to have to develop this a little bit more later because I haven't got it quite done, but I've already mentioned that the word euthos is mentioned 41 times in the book of Mark. That's got to be a key word. Right? It's translated as immediately, straightway. What was the other one? Pardon? No. Forthwith. Okay, those are three English words that are all translated from this one Greek word, euthos. And it's got to be a dominant word. There may be other words, but I haven't come across them yet. Key verse to the book is undoubtedly chapter 10, verse 45. Mark chapter 10, verse 45, the key verse to the book. It's one that you should memorize if you haven't already. Mark 10:45. In Jesus' own words, he said, "For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many." That verse is found in some of the other Gospels as well, but it is particularly significant in Mark. Mark chapter 10, verse 45. For those of you who are taking Greek, I'll just mention this because it is a point of interest. But this verse is, the tenses in this verse are a little significant. It says, "The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister." That's an aorist. It's not present tense. It doesn't stress the continuous, ongoing, day-by-day service of Christ. But in the aorist tense, punctiliar action, it says that his whole life, period, was ministry. That's the significance of the aorist tense. Point a dot to it, and that is, it all focuses down on ministry. To minister, period, and to give his life a ransom for many. To give his life a ransom was the final act, kind of like the exclamation mark to a life of ministry. There are other verses in the New Testament that are not found in the book of Mark itself that stress the same theme. If you wish, you could put them down as cross-references to the key verse. Luke 22:27, Jesus said, "I am among you as he that serveth." And there he put it in the present tense, as he that is continually serving. On and on and on and on without a break. "I am among you as he that serveth." That's Luke 22:27. Matthew 20:28. "The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many." That's a direct parallel to Mark 10:45. And of course, that key verse in Philippians chapter 2, verses 6-8, that Christ made himself of no reputation, took upon himself the form of a servant, a doulos, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death. Wherefore God has highly exalted him. That's Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 8. There's a play on words there. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 8, it uses the word form and fashion. And he took upon himself the form of a servant. This is the word morphe. Which means the essential nature, or the real essence. That's what a person is inwardly. He had the form of, so if you had to describe Christ, the best word you could use was slave. That's what he took upon himself in the incarnation. He was essentially a slave, the form of a servant. This refers to the inner nature of his person. But then he goes on in Philippians chapter 2 and he says, he was made in the likeness of men and being found in fashion as a man. This word is not morphe, it's schema, whatever. Is related to fashion is not inward, but outward. It has to do with the visible, what you see with your eye. And so when Jesus Christ came into the world, what you saw was a man. He looked like a man. He looked like an ordinary person. Isaiah chapter 52, right? That there was nothing unique about him. He didn't look like Charles Atlas or, Hebrews chapter 2 says that he took upon himself the seed of Abraham. See? That is a human body. The schema, the outward appearance, but inwardly, if you had to describe him essentially, he was a slave. A good cross-reference to the theme and the key verse in Mark. I am come to minister and to give my life a ransom for those who's his raison d'etre, or d'etre. Right? The reason for being is to be a slave. I'm not sure what the key chapter of the book is. I would say perhaps chapter 10, because it was in chapter 10 that Jesus settled this argument between his disciples as to who would be exalted in the kingdom. And Jesus said, well, the people that are going to win are the ones that lose out here. If you're going to win there, you have to be last here. Okay? That comes in chapter 10. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll leave it at that for tonight. And we shouldn't have any trouble finishing Mark next week. What I would suggest is that you just do a little scanning if you have a half an hour sometime. And if look for anything that puzzles you or has given